Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Women in Localization in partnership with our Diamond sponsor, Lil. Today's call is being recorded. Attendees are currently in listen-only mode and have the opportunity to submit questions via the chat during the presentation. We're going to jump right in today, so it's my pleasure to hand you over to our speakers for introductions and an exciting presentation. Thank you. You may now begin.
Thank you so much, Becky. For those of you on the call today, thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to go through the topics today. While I'm shown as being a panelist, I'll kind of function a little bit more maybe like a facilitator or moderator. And the reason for that is that we have two people you'll hear from in a moment with just tremendous experience. So we'll kick off and we'll get to know the two other panelists, Denisse and Jennifer. And then we'll go through the topics. We don't have an overwhelming amount of content, which I think is a good thing on Zoom. We've got a few data points from the State of Localization report, which collaborated on with Women in Localization. So we've pulled out some leading and lagging indicators from that report that we'd want to dive in and really have a conversation about. And then, as everyone always promises, we will have question and answer at the end. We will absolutely leave time open for that. But I think the most important thing is I'm excited to share with you the two other panelists who, just if you look at their background, you look at the experience that each has had. I mean, I think starting in 2007 and 2005 in a variety of different roles, but you'll hear directly from them because I think what's really fascinating is the focus that each has had through their career on kind of the consumer, the end consumer of our work and our efforts in localization. And I think this makes for a very different webinar from when we're looking more at kind of big tech, or we're looking at localization that has to happen as opposed to localization that must happen. So Denisse, I'd love to start with you if you'd like to give an introduction to your illustrious career and focus within the gaming industry.
Thank you, Paula, and hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in and listening. So yes, I am Denisse Kreeger. I have been in localization for about 15 years. I started off outside of the entertainment space and working in federal government areas, which, yeah, surprise, they need localization too. And moved into entertainment and in the, latter part of my career. I've worked at places like Netflix, Blizzard Entertainment, and now Riot Games. Yes, I'm excited to be here, and I'll pass it over to Jennifer.
Hello, hi everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this panel to LILT and to Women in Localization. So as Denisse and Paula have mentioned, I've been in the localization industry for a little bit of time. I started my career as a translator, and I was mostly involved in the multimedia, video games, audiovisual industry. And after that, I moved to the traveling industry with Expedia, which is the current role that I have now as a vendor manager. But meanwhile, I've also been, and I'm continue being very interested in the different points of view of localization, not just now as a client with Expedia, but also as a provider, as a translator, as a quality manager, and also as a researcher. I think there is so much potential when we all communicate and we all collaborate to help to advance the industry that precisely events like this are great opportunities to get all those insights and get all of us to share our knowledge, our vision, and just learn from each other.
Jennifer, thank you very much. And I hope that people will take the time to maybe learn a little bit more about both of you. I was so impressed. I mean, it's not often that you have a range of deep localization expertise, at the core of getting out products and services and offerings. But each of you have done so many interesting things. I mean, from guest lecturing at a university level to pursuing entrepreneurial programs, at a leading university and beyond. So I really feel that we've got an interesting viewpoint here today. For those of you who don't know me, I had a wonderful career at Berlitz, where I was for almost 18 years. I guess known for heading up their revenue and sales organizations, but perhaps lesser known, I also served for 3 years as co-general manager of the core $300 million localization business. So I definitely have had a chance to work with some of the most interesting clients in the world. Before that, I was with Berlitz and also a stint at Altnet. So since 2019, I've been out working with Lilt as chief evangelist. And also I've got some consulting I do really outside of the localization industry with other businesses. So it's been a fascinating time to see more of the struggles that people have as they're bringing businesses, new offerings and products and services to global markets. So let's jump right in. I promised that we would frame this with some of the data from the State of Localization 2021 report that was done. So to give a sense of the breadth of this, it really surveyed over 900 different professionals. And you'll see there's kind of always with this data, there's a good news and maybe a less good news angle to some of this. So for me, the good news is this was a broad survey. We got great participation. Women in Loc do such a nice job with this. We had 11 different types of departments represented. We had over 40 different countries, which is very, very important that this not be US-centric or Euro-centric. And here's where I find it's kind of the tale of two summers. 71% of the respondents were individual contributors, 23% middle management, and only 6% in a senior leadership role. And I think as Jennifer and Denisse and I chat about this a little bit more, you'll start to see that that becomes a theme in some of these pain points that we discuss. So no more insight here, just to let you know, this was a wonderful effort and we did get some really nice insights out of the report. Now, if we begin to look at what some of those were, we look at this next slide. This is near and dear to my heart. So I'd say that throughout my own career, pushing hard and trying to understand how people viewed the impact of localization at a business level was always very central to what I did or what I did with my teams. And this data, again, good news, bad news, because great news, 84% of the respondents really see it. This has a direct impact on revenue, meaning localization. I mean, not a surprise, but it's always great when you see such stark, statistical information. And 84% also felt that this has a direct impact on company brand. So again, no surprise, but great to see it articulated. 91% of the respondents really see that this has a direct impact on customer experience. Now you're seeing why I'm so enthusiastic about having two people on the panel today who represent more consumer-oriented brands. So 80% feel that this is really highly impacting their business, but only 51% believe that localization has a priority place in their company strategy. We have other data behind this that really reinforces the same thing. So good news, yes, it's important. There's no argument there. Maybe less good news, not really valued on that. So I'd like to kick off then and ask the panelists, first off, what was your own reaction to these statistics, Denisse, when you saw them for the first time?
I wasn't surprised, Paula. As a matter of fact, I find this to be a regular conversation that I have to have even with my own team, which is the sentiment that we're in localization, we're doing all these efforts to enable globalization. However, it doesn't always come across as being valued or being understood. We tend to be the downstream sort of part of the products that are being built and produced, and sometimes they're at the detriment to our operations. And so education is something that is at the core fundamental piece of our production teams when I've worked with producers, which is what I do now, what I've done in the last several years, is we need to educate our stakeholders. We need to educate our stakeholders. It's always the presence of what we do because of this particular challenge. Now, the other thing I will say about this is it seems to me that sometimes localization, while it more traditionally on the product creation side tends to be down the operational spectrum, it doesn't always seem to fit, in the right spot. So I have experienced so many reorganizations and restructures where they just don't know what to do with us, right? And I think that's part of some of the challenges that we face is if we can move some of the strategy that goes with globalization and going into new markets and the investment that is, then we should be putting those departments into kind of that part of the strategy, the leadership, part of the engagement that we need from sort of our senior leaders to understand what impact it actually has. Because as you can see here, and based on the numbers that you just showed us before, the respondents aren't all in localization, right? So if you get to understand how localization works and the direct impact it has on the customer, which surprisingly not that many people put that together, then I think it really is obvious why it's so important.
Yeah, Denisse, I shared with the audience, I knew that this would be great because obviously we've spent some time together as a trio, and I know that you're passionate about this as I am as well. And Jennifer, I'm really curious to see, maybe even taking Denisse's comments and going forward, this notion, that localization is not really sitting within the company at the right place or in the right organization. Do you have some thoughts about that as well?
Yes, definitely. I think, as Denisse said, I think localization has traditionally be seen as a commodity, as a cost, and therefore it sits at the very end. So you do everything else, you do the product, and when everything is finished, then you think, oh, actually, I need to translate, I need to localize, but might be too late. And actually, normally, it's too late. I do believe that, again, it's trying to change it from a commodity to a mindset. Or my opinion is actually localization is like a globalization, is a mindset. The whole organization needs to have that mindset. So that is not something that is relegated, is put it at the end, or is also isolated. I think we'll see it later that because many companies do not know where to put localization, either is in some team, but then is very isolated from what other teams are doing, or it is a little bit of everywhere, but there is not centralized. So it's all over the place. And I will see that it seems that it's not a perfect way to actually decide how to build a localization team, where to put it. But that's definitely, I think it's regarding and related to talk about the mindset of what localization and globalization means, and then how you correlate when we're seeing here. Actually, I wanted to say that I am very happy to see such high percentages in thinking that localization has an impact in customer experience and company brand, because the impact on revenue, I think it was more or less clear before. That's why it's seen as a need sometimes, because you need to translate it to localize to be able to sell more. But I think until maybe the last 5-10 years, it wasn't so clear that the impact of localization has on company brand, company image, customer experience. And having now the data, because now it's easier to measure that, and it's easier to take the data and show it to the leadership, that is actually what is helping a lot to evangelize localization and to change the mindset of the whole company, so that they embrace localization as something that is cross-functional, cross-team.
Jennifer, that's great. And what a perfect continuation of thought. I guess I get to have a few opinions as well, just given my own background. And one of the things I'm most thrilled about is exactly what you said, this notion that localization is starting to emerge as one of the most powerful levers in the customer experience continuum. My own personal opinion is that I would love to see the advent or the rise of the customer experience officer as a C-level CXO in a company. And it doesn't have to be only consumer brands, right? I mean, anyone is experienced with the end-to-end, anyone is interested in the end-to-end experience, of their customer or end user. So I really think the elevation of a CXO role, where the localization person would sit as a senior member of that panel, if not one of the core, might be a great future to think about. And this is a perfect segue to our next slide, because we want to talk a little bit on this one with both of you about that senior leadership. that's lacking, you know, the access to senior leadership, let's call it. So we talked again about the people who participated in this survey. This is the same data that you're seeing here, individual level, middle management, and very, very few senior leaders. So let's move beyond just kind of bemoaning the fact that we didn't have as many of them and talk about what you do then to engage, or what you think is important when you're engaging senior leadership. So what I'm really after here is, you know, I'm trying to understand how you quantify the localization investment in business terms, the ROI that you show, the return. We'll talk in a moment. There is another slide where we look at how different people measure this. But right now I'm talking about you as a leader in your company. Let's say you get some time at a senior level presentation. What do you go for? Jennifer, maybe we start with you and then go on to Denisse.
Sure. In my experience, one of the things that we always need to prioritize, and maybe we haven't been so good in the past, maybe because we didn't have the data to do it, is we need, as a localization team and a localization advocates, to correlate very clearly our goals and our results to the vision and the goals of the whole company. They need to be completely aligned. So first, we do need to understand what is the mission and the vision of our own company. What are their priorities? What are their pain points? And then see how we can solve and how we can help from the localization point of view. And then establish metrics, data that we can share with them, so then it's easier for the C-level to precisely understand what is benefit, and also actually what is the missed opportunity. It could be both ways, not just what you can do better, but also what are the opportunities that you are missing at this moment, because the localization strategy is not the right one. So to me, the two main points are that it's like to speak the language of the organization, not to get too closed on the language of localization, and find the metrics that work for the organization and for the localization team.
Denisse, how about you? I mean, I've got a sense as you've risen up through the gaming industry that you've had a voice at the table, and I'm wondering how you get that, and when you're there, what are the things that you feel are important to showcase?
Well, in addition to some of the areas that Jennifer was mentioning, I try to go at an angle that highlights how important the global market is. So I usually try to look at the numbers of the audience or the players or, you know, subscribers. And I look at the percentage that's outside of the English experience. And I always use that number to my advantage, because guess what? If you're a global company, it's very likely that that English experience is going to be less than half of your actual global audience. And so that usually helps paint the picture of how important localization is. It's something that I've been attempting to do or doing for so many years now. When I used to do presentations at Netflix, I would always throw in that about 5% of the world population is an English native speaker. And I think that really sort of shakes people up, because a lot of the products that we tend to work on are focused on that English experience, when in reality, you're building something, you're putting something together, creating something that isn't taking in mind that global mindset that we were talking about. And while on paper, a lot of companies will say, we're globally minded, you know, it's all about our global experience. Really, the action plan behind that, the importance behind that, is something that we need to continue to fight for and highlight. I find it interesting, and I'm going to get a little spicy here, that we can spend millions and millions of dollars on marketing, for instance, where we really don't look at the bills sometimes in a lot of companies, but then we are worried about what localization is spending. Those two things, I think, don't make sense, because if you're going to go ahead and spend all this money to market your product, to get that engagement, you need something to keep your audience there. And so these are the sort of types of conversations and numbers. I like to compare sometimes even what is a marketing team spending? What is the original English video production spending? And then I try to quantify that, or to be able to compare. Look, we're doing all these languages, and this is what we're spending, yet we're accounting for such a larger part of the audience that's actually keeping us afloat. So that's my angle.
Yeah, and I mean, I had a strong feeling, Denisse, you wouldn't stand a chance in the room with you if you get going. So what you said is so important to actually be understanding the impact that you're having on that goal, on that global goal. I think it's interesting. I was going to share some of my own experience. Maybe we could do that on the next slide, because this is a bit of a continuation of what we're talking about. So obviously, working at a company like Lionbridge, the localization and the role of localization is core. So you're not in there having to make any type of a case for that. But in my role heading up sales and revenue and training salespeople and leading sales teams, anyone that's worked with me knows, I was very much focused on how to make this about the customer, how to do better research than someone else that was out there. And what it all comes down to is understanding that business, understanding what they were really trying to do. So Denisse, as you just said, maybe it's that, the tension between what we see here on screen, that a marketing department is going to be very concerned with traffic. So the way this scatter chart works, you've got the criteria on the left here. What are the different teams looking at? So marketing, traffic volume. We're looking on the brand side, very concerned with things like net promoter score, looking at the brand awareness, of course, just as you might think. And so there are always multiple stakeholders in any situation, whether you and Jennifer are pitching and pushing within your own companies, or whether someone on the webinar is having a discussion with a prospect or a client. And not understanding this landscape, I think personally, is a sure sign that you will fail. And so it's very, very important to get out of the trap of quantifying what we do in terms of cost and unit cost. We all know that. We've been talking about that for years. But I love what Denisse just said, where she actually is going to go in and look at what the marketing department is spending. And I'm going to assume, Denisse, it's, then you're going to kind of figure that out per the impact that they assert that they deliver. You're going to figure out what the original source content creation cost, so that you can frame your own investment in very different lenses. I think that's so important. So this slide, as I said, this is the input about asking the different participants, these 900 plus people, 11 different departments in 40 countries, how they measure localization success. So I'd really love to jump into this with you and ask you, Jennifer, for you, perhaps right now in your own role, which of these measures are the most important to you? And let's also talk about which ones do you wish you had? Maybe there's data that you can't get your hands on, but you wish you had. Do you have a feeling about either of those questions?
Sure. So as we mentioned, because there are so many different localization metrics and measures that we can use now, which is great. Now we can have the luxury of select which ones are going to make more sense depending on the stakeholder we're talking. For the marketing team, the ones that we are seeing on the side of the slide are going to make more sense. While if we are going or working with the customer experience team, then we will use those they're going to feel more familiarized with. So in my opinion, I think the one that I think is the one that could help the most is, so one of the things that we have seen is that it still is very difficult to isolate the impact that is coming only from the localization efforts. And with the other things that are related to localization. For example, if we're in a campaign, there is the sign, there is how the campaign was done, there is the localization part. So sometimes it's quite difficult to isolate what localization did, the team did, that helped the design team, that helped the marketing team, so that we can isolate the ROI in a clear way. So to me, the metric that has helped the most when we are trying to do these tests, it's to do A/B tests, to actually use exactly the same setup, let's say the same marketing team, the same marketing strategy, or the same website, or the same app, and change the localization, change the translation. And that is the only thing that we would change. And then measure what happens. Measure all of these things when the only thing that we have changed has been the localization, the translation itself. To me, that is the measure, the metric that has been the most optimal to really say this is just because of the localization work. So that's the one to me, but it's also quite difficult, very, very difficult sometimes to do. And it requires collaboration from many other teams, especially because they need to be in production. So there can be some risks maybe related to that. But that's the one to me I really like, and I push quite a lot to try to see if we can work with the customer experience team, with the marketing teams to create these A/B tests.
That's a super answer, Jennifer. I really like that example. And, you know, it's amazing how the digitization of marketing, in my opinion, has really changed so much for the good. You know, first of all, I think marketing is way ahead of sales in terms of using digital information effectively. So what I mean is a professional pursuit that was viewed more as maybe peripheral, notional by financial executives in a company, you know, within a decade, using digital tools became able to defend their investments, their ROI, and really show in quantified terms, you know, what the impact was. So I love that you ally yourself with that. I think I've seen in my own career localization teams that have gone into support, not because support was maybe the sexiest area of the company, but they had the most data around customer feedback and experience. Denisse, I think that we definitely talked about this, and I know at Riot, you look at some really unique metrics that are very interesting, you know, or at least the teams look at sentiment surveys and player sentiment surveys. You want to talk a little bit about things that you've been able to get at that give you an idea of the value of localization?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, in the gaming industry is quite common to have these player sentiment surveys, which are tackling a specific language and how that experience is perceived by players. Things like translation quality, immersiveness, authenticity. And the challenging thing about these numbers, which I think is related to the conversation we were just having, is that there is still difficulty correlating how that sentiment from that sample group is directly impacting that brand and engagement. There's still sometimes a disconnect, especially in gaming. Why in gaming? Because there's, I think, a notion or an argument that can be made that it's the product. While in some other types of localization, you probably could go to a website and not be able to read it, or watch a piece of content, a movie, and if it's not localized, you may not be able to follow. But with a game, you may still be able to get into the game and play it. It just won't be as immersive. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have in gaming, and being able to use these KPIs or these metrics, because you show them and there's still sometimes a notion from our development teams that, well, the product's good, so people are going to play the game anyway, which is also a whole other hurdle to overcome. But I think we're constantly looking for better ways to frame this, and again, find those connections of that brand experience, the engagement, the, you know, brand piece to me is one that I think in theory, all of us in concept, we all understand how important a brand is. But I think the thing that's missing is would love to hear more people say that brand and user experience is directly impacted by localization, which again, even though that may seem very obvious, I feel there's still a bridge that needs to connect those areas. And it's not initially obvious to people, unfortunately.
Denisse, great insight. And I think that's why it's so fascinating to have a view into travel and gaming and different ways of doing things. From my experience, both you and Jennifer are ahead of the curve a bit from where many of the localization professionals, maybe even on this call, sit when they're in a big tech company. They sit within a company where this is maybe an ancillary activity to financial services, et cetera. So I think your examples are really inspirational. And I'd love to then transition to this next, we have two slides that look at this next question differently. often for me, this is kind of, to be honest, more of a boring topic because I feel that we just rehash the same localization pain points over and over. And if you're hearing a theme, it's that I really don't like when we're myopic. You know, when we look at localization as a function or an industry, I'm sometimes not sure that we are an industry. I mean, we are a vibrant part of many different companies' effort to get products and services global. So in the old days, we'd hear about pain points around translation quality, you know, vendors and the rest of it. I'd love to hear your perspective right now about on this list of things. What for you are the pain points that you experience today? Jennifer, maybe you first.
Yes. Well, I have to say that with Expedia, because they are quite mature in terms of the localization maturity model. They have been able to already overcome some of the pain points that actually are more related to the level of maturity of the level in terms of localization, which are normally, I would say, the lack of automation. It's, to me, directly related to a lower level of maturity in the localization processes, as is the insufficient budget and inadequate planning. So I think these three ones, what I've seen is that they come more in those companies that are still doing things very manually because they don't have a proper localization strategy in place, and they are more reactive. They're reacting to what they need instead of being proactive. The other three, complex processes and limited bandwidth and translation quality, could still happen in any company. Those are even more complicated and more complex. And these come because our industry or us as a function, it has to be able to adapt to the different needs of the company, and these needs change constantly. And it's not always easy to be able to ramp up, scale up, scale down, keep up with the new technologies, and keep up with the new ideas that come and needs that come from our companies. So what we need here again is to have a proper strategy that is able to mature with the company. So the more mature a company is, the more mature the localization strategy should be. And that includes the quality management strategy, their vendor strategy, and their automation strategy, their technology strategy. So all of those things, they need to be in the overall strategy so that they are able to meet the needs of the company.
Jennifer, thank you. And then Denisse, what's your sense about this? And again, these were the common localization pain points that came out of the first part of the survey data. What's your sense about this? Any thoughts?
I'm actually very aligned with what Jennifer said in terms of strategy and planning. I would say that's probably the root cause of a lot of issues or challenges that I've observed throughout my career. I would say that the two things would be complex processes and inadequate planning, which I think go hand in hand. So one thing I've observed is, and this is why localization is so important, and all of you here, you're important because it's such a key thing to understand localization, to understand how to effectively create pipelines for it, how to build workflows that are going to be effective. And those things come with experience, knowledge, education, and so on. But what I have observed that happens a lot is when you have a company that starts very young, which is again related to what Jennifer was mentioning, the maturity level of the company, some of the foundational structure that's built doesn't always come from localization experts. So you start building a foundation for what is going to be your localization workflows and pipelines, maybe even some homegrown tools that are doing some sort of automation. And then you just keep piling and building on top of it, piling and building on top of it. And then that whole system that you've built doesn't have a strong foundation, isn't scalable. And now you have to keep operations and business continuity going, which becomes a big entanglement. And I feel this is something that I consistently see, which takes a lot of resources, a lot of effort to go back and sort of rebuild that foundation. So that's why complex processes is something that I feel very close to some of what the challenges that I see, especially when you work in tech companies where there's a bunch of engineers that say, oh, I can fix that. I got this. I can build a tool that does that thing, but they don't actually know localization. And so again, it sort of just creates all these layers of more and more complicated things when something maybe doesn't require it to be, if you just, were able to build it according to maybe the tools that already are off the shelf that exist in the industry, or perhaps building an outsourcing pipeline for certain services. So I would say that's a huge hurdle to overcome sometimes as you are helping a company reach that maturity level that Jennifer was talking about. And again, the other challenge that I believe we have is the ever-changing technology that we're currently engaging with, right? We have a lot of solutions that go beyond what we know as CAT tools to machine translation, neuromachine translation. We've got, text to speech, speech to text, auto captioning. So it's just, there's so much out there that I also think that stirs a lot of curiosity sometimes. And there's a need to also understand how mature these technologies are and where they fit and where they don't fit. And going through that journey as well can cause a lot of pain, a lot of waste of resources and time. And so overall, I think, again, it's the planning, the strategy, and just ensuring that you're simplifying what you're trying to do, and you're creating a foundation that will allow you to make it sustainable, basically.
That's a great window, Denisse, into it. And I mean, you've got Jennifer's perspective, years of work, and she's been at, at Expedia for quite a good amount of time. Look at Riot Games. I mean, what a ride, right? You've got a company that effectively, exploded onto the scene, with League of Legends in like 2007 or so, and must have gone from like a Series A company to a global dominating games producer, with now parent Tencent. And I can't imagine that on the path between then and now, there's been a lot of time to just step back, like leisurely time, to see about building exactly what you just described, some of these processes and the infrastructure. So a wild ride for both of you. And why don't we look at the next slide, which is our last one, because then we're going to get into questions. And I know we've touched a little bit on this, but make no mistake, there are a lot of people on today's webinar who would love to know what matters to both of you, right? They'd like to work with you. Maybe they want to be both at your company, or they'd like to provide services, or really just learn from you. So two kind of questions here. One is, if you could talk about where you would put yourself on this array of the 2021 focus and priorities. So this data came back to us from the survey. But then if you could also tell us, what do you think is missing? So as perhaps Women in Loc and Loc go out next year and look at this, what would you think is missing from this focus and priorities for you?
I'll take it. I think in general, I agree quite a lot with this slide. I think that what is put here as the most important is the basics. So you do need to have a translation that has quality, that is consistent, that has the right delivery turnaround that you need, and that is efficient. So that's the basic. So I would say that that is the first thing you need to cover to even start thinking about the rest. I think in my experience, again, especially with Expedia, as I mentioned, because they do have a long tradition in the market, and also their translation and localization team is quite mature. They have been able to cover the most important things that we have here. And we are now in what here is considered least important, but for us, actually, these are the most important ones, because they are the ones that still see that can be improved. So we are now in the part of innovation mostly. As Denisse mentioned, the amount of new things that are happening now in the translation and localization industry in terms of technologies and tools, there are so many things going there. There's so much innovation there that we still need to explore, and we need to actually find the right fit for us. And I guess localizations teams, I think at this point, it would be great to have an R&D person in each localization team, a person that can just take a look to all of these and make sense of it, and actually be able to select the ones that are really gonna make a difference for the company. So for us, innovation, vendor partnership, For Expedia, since we do have many different products and we have quite a big ecosystem, we do cultivate long-term partnership with our vendors. We do believe in growing together. We do believe in that the more we mature and the more complex we are as a company, the more we want to help our vendors to evolve with us and to grow with us. So that's one of the things that for us, actually is very, very important, because we do want the vendor to be part of our extended team. And that also means that for us, trust, transparency, and responsiveness is very, very important too, because we want to be able to scale up and ramp up thanks to our vendors. And that means having that kind of relationship with them.
Jennifer, thanks. And Denisse, I'll put you a little bit on the spot, because I think you're in a fascinating position. So you came in November 2020, so you've been just in this cauldron of change since then, but you came in as head of the global localization production at Riot. So I've got to imagine that you're just hitting your stride for change and kind of implementing the vision of where you want to take the team. So what's important for you on this slide, and what do you think is missing as we go into 2022?
Well, I think this slide encompasses a lot of the focus areas and priorities. The only one thing that I would highlight, which is something that I alluded to or spoke about earlier, is that the focus is to continue to build that localization awareness. That education piece is something that is very much embedded in things that we want to achieve for us. In terms of the specific areas that are most important here, is you'll hear me talk about scalability, sustainability, efficiency. However, that does not mean that it's at the detriment of quality. So quality is definitely top of mind. It's something that, I've been fortunate that the companies I have worked for and with actually really care about quality, sometimes to an extent where it just causes a really massive amount of inefficiency. So I think that's how what the focus is how do we create an efficient workflow for localization, the products, in a way that's also not going to be really a burden on overhead or a burden on a lot of different complex processes, as we were mentioning. So speed is important as well. And that's something that we can't get away from, which is one of the things that when I was a translator a long time ago, you always argue, I need more time. If you want a really great product or really great translation, I need more time. But the reality is that we live in a world where everything's instant gratification. You have an attention span that just moves from one place to another. We have things in the gaming industry like esports. You have a tournament. The moment that goes out, within a few hours, that's stale content. So we can't really make an argument for more time. So we do have to find ways to create that efficiency and that speed, but really protect that quality. So I think those are the priorities, is to continue to build growth and scalability, as I mentioned before, mature the business, ensure that we can keep that quality and that engagement from our players, because that's what we pride ourselves for. And then at the same time, build a sustainable foundation for the future, because the other, I think, area on top of what we're discussing here is that things are being thrown at us constantly, new ventures, new types of content, new ways of producing something. And so we have to have some level of dynamic flexibility to be able to take those on and adjust and be able to still produce good quality localization.
All right, super. And we've got some good questions. So let's jump in as promised, because we want to bring the webinar to a close in time to let people have a break before they roll on to their next call. Let's do rapid fire. Some of these could be quick answers. So Jennifer, I think this one goes back to something you said. It's a question about the awareness that companies typically have around localization. So question to you both. Do you think that smaller companies are usually less aware than the bigger corporations just because of their, initially limited reach? Or do you think that there are big companies too that have little or no clue about the LOC processes. So what's your sense, just an opinion?
Both. I think it doesn't, I mean, it doesn't have to be because it's a big company that it could be a very mature company, but not in terms of localization, especially when they're all strategy, if they always have seen localization as a commodity, as an afterthought. There might be startups that are much more agile from the very beginning, and they saw localization from the very beginning as their core, that are much more mature in terms of localization. So no, not in my opinion.
I agree. I've seen both situations, a small company that, really understands versus a big company. I think it's more about, I don't want to repeat myself, but I do think there's a level of investment that has to happen from localization leaders as high up as you can to talk and influence of how important localization is. And I think that's what makes a difference. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's not just the metrics and the data, but it's also, hey, let me tell you why this is important. Let me build this awareness for you to keep it in your mind every time. And that's something I strategically do whenever there's a new sort of service type or a new group that's added to the slate of stakeholders we support. I really spend a good amount of time teaching and ensuring that they understand the amount of work that goes into it, so they see the value and the effort, and they also start thinking and advocating for us, which does happen. It just does require a good amount of time, and when you're really busy with so many other things, you sometimes think, oh, I don't have time for this, but guess what? It will set you up for success in the future. So invest in those relationships and talk about localization as much as you can.
Yeah, that's super solid advice. And again, I mean, that seems consistent with the way that you've made sure that you have a seat at the table. A couple of other questions, which I think are really important, because we often talk internally, certainly at Lilt, and we've spoken with women in localization about, if you go back to that first survey about the number of individual contributors that participated, you see what I'm getting at. There really is not a group of people within a given company who can mentor and educate people in the localization profession. By extension, they need to look outside of their companies at other localization professionals. I think that's why the industry has so much networking, and women in localization has filled an incredibly important role. So this question is to you, for both of you. How does your involvement, because you are both very involved at Women in Loc, how does your involvement with women in localization aid or help you in your continued learning and education in the Loc industry?
I'm happy to jump in first. So for all of you here, I am the chapter manager for the LA chapter of Women in Localization. And I've spoken about this before. I think it's important for us to support each other and help each other, especially when it comes to career, leadership, and so on. But I think the most important piece is our industry or our function is constantly evolving, changing. It's such a broad amount of content that we touch in different ways that I think it's a great space for learning. I'm learning every day. I learn from the lovely women that I work with in Women in Localization. I learn from our panels. I learn from the questions that are being asked that make me think about, oh, I hadn't, really looked into this particular topic. So I'd say networking is very important. And to answer or to follow on the comment you made, Paula, it is true. I often, from the teams that I lead and the individual contributors that I work with, they often say, I don't have a mentor. Like, I don't, until we start speaking, and they, fortunately for me, they see me as that. But before I come along, sometimes they're like, I didn't really have anybody to really teach me the ways of localization that has a breadth of experience that, has been in the industry for a while. And I think we need to just create more of that presence and hopefully carve ourselves some more spaces at the leadership level so that we can continue to pass this on, because guess what? Localization is needed everywhere.
Jennifer, how about you?
My experience is quite similar to those two as Denisse. So in my case, I'm the geo manager for the European region for Women in Localization. And when I joined Women in Localization, was actually what I was looking is a place where I could learn, and that it would be a way of just exchanging information, just talking to other people and doing networking. Let's say like in a safe space, in the sense of being completely honest and candid and transparent, and not having to think whether, you know, this is a company that is maybe a competitor. So at that moment, and I'm talking about maybe 5-6 years ago, so you had the events, official events, like for example, Log World, which were actually, they're very good, is great, but you normally have a company presentation, right? And they would mostly tell you their successes and how well they're doing, but you couldn't really learn how they're doing. You couldn't really, I didn't feel that there was a space in which I could approach people and say, hey, I love what you're doing. Can you tell me more? Hey, you know, in my company, we're thinking about going, I don't know, machine translation. What is your experience about that? So the fact that there was an organization like Women in Localization that for free, you could go to all the events that they organized. You also could go to the networking. You could then even watch the recordings, and whatever you're interested in learning, you then have not just the trainings and the events, but then you can even contact the person and say, hey, I want to learn about this. Even there is a mentoring program in which you also can go there and say, I need a mentor, as Denisse was saying, I need a mentor. I don't know how else I can progress. I don't know how I can actually be closer to the C-level. So that's, I would say, the mentoring, the training, and the networking in an informal environment where everybody wants to just help each other and support each other. It's a very unique environment. And to me, it's one of the best things about women in localization.
Thanks, Jennifer. I think that was such a great description of why this is of value. I'm going to ask our last question, and I'll take the liberty of jumping in and answering first. So we had a great question about what are the skills, you know, both soft and hard skills that stand out from applicants. You know, we're assuming both of you are in a leadership position where you're screening applicants, and wondering if there were any tips that you had for people who were looking to get into the industry, or I told you, people who might be interested in joining you both at your journey, either at Expedia or Riot Games. And I'm going to throw one thing out, because people who know me on the call would be shocked if I didn't, and that is that I have always felt that one of the most important things that you need to add to your portfolio, one needs to add to one's portfolio as you go up the ladder, is financial acumen and financial knowledge. And there are many different ways to get this. I mean, some people may have completed a classic business degree. They may have done a graduate business degree, an MBA. And if you're not fortunate enough to have done that, or you didn't have the interest in it, you can do really applicable finance for non-financial manager courses. So my point here is that many of you will have learned how to manage at a P&L level, a department level, a budget level, but it's critical to understand how your company makes money, how your company generates cash, and how your company is valued. And if you understand those things, when you do get a seat at the table and you get to assert the strategic value of localization, you can do it in a very meaningful way and really elevate your department and elevate your own career. So that's it. That's my huge soapbox is you owe it to yourself. You can do this at a local university. Many of them offer 2, 3, 4-day programs. There are, of course, online programs and books, but this is not a double-digit investment. This is a very simple thing to chew off and to do, and I would recommend it. So Denisse and Jennifer, to wrap up, what would be the things that you recommend? So skills, hard and soft, and then tips for applicants who want to get into this.
Let me take it then. So there could be different types of applicants, whether they are actually interested in being a translator, an internal translator, or a vendor translation agency, project manager, quality manager, vendor manager. But I think I think the ones that probably are the most common is for internal translators in this case. I think in companies like Expedia, where there is a lot of very different products, even different brands, it's very important to have a translator that it's able to tackle different types of translation, and is equally comfortable doing either more creative translation, like marketing, transcreation, but then also even being able to do localization, website, and user interface, so that with that one person, they can take care of all the different needs in terms of translation. That is quite rare because normally as a freelancer, a translator will specialize in one thing or the other, but it's the opposite, at least in companies like Expedia. So being able to be equally good at both creative translation and more even semi-legal translation or product or software translation is a really good advantage to have, and it's going to help quite a lot. And then, of course, being tech savvy, being aware of all the new things that we have been mentioning and different tools and different technologies that also will help a lot.
Jennifer, thanks. It's so lovely to hear your approach and the benefit of your experience. And we'll wrap up, Denisse, hearing from you. And you know, we promised we'd bring this in on time. So what a time to be alive. You get the wisdom of Jennifer and Denisse, and you have 5 minutes to get a tea or coffee or what have you. So Denisse, what's important for you? What would you recommend to people?
Yeah, I hesitated to jump in right away because I really had to think about it. I think it's a difficult question to answer, and it also really depends on what your path is. I would say, in sort of similarity to what Jennifer was saying, is adaptability and flexibility is really important. It's sort of the notion that complacency isn't an option, that there's always room for improvement and learning. I think it's very important, especially in the era that we live in now and how you know, our localization industry is evolving constantly. So being able to do that. The other thing that I look for, especially because, just for clarification, a lot of the focus roles that I work with are program managers, project managers, producers of localization. So there's a really huge need of communication. Communication is so important. Honestly, that if I could say invest in something, invest in being a great communicator. Because if you're able to take complex problems and simplify them for the audience where you need to develop influence, then that's going to help your career in whatever direction you want to go. Whether it's you want to influence a team because you want to improve a process, or you want to influence your own manager, that, you know, maybe you want that next promotion because look at the things that you're doing and the value that you're bringing to your organization. That is super important. So I'd say definitely being able to invest on your communication skills and your ability to, again, break down complex problems so that you can adapt your communication to your audience is going to set you up for success.
Denisse, what a perfect place to finish, because I think that you and Jennifer did such a great job in communicating and articulating all of this today. So I want to thank you both, truly, because this was wonderful to have an easy kind of fluid conversation about these topics. And special thanks to both the team at Lilt for pulling all this together in the slides, as well as Women in Localization for sponsoring the survey, for using the infrastructure and the audience to get this out. It's just wonderful when we have a chance to talk about data and then go from there. So I want to say thank you very much, and not sure, back over, Becky, perhaps to you to close out if there's anything I'm sure I'm forgetting. Oh, good, you've got the link for downloading the report.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks everyone for joining today. This will be available later on the Women in Localization YouTube channel, so you can watch the recording there. And that will end the event today, and have a great rest of your day.